Please welcome Andra Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory University.
Good afternoon. Thank you, and thank you to the disembodied voice who just introduced me. So my role today here is to represent you, the interested audience, and so I'm happy to represent you and lead you in this discussion this afternoon. So let me start by welcoming our three panelists to the stage. So first, Dr. Sarah Bryner of the Center for Responsive Politics. Next, Dr. Jennifer Sciubba of Rhodes College. And last but not least, Dr. Daniel Stid of the Hewlett Foundation. So while members of our guild are not just represented on this panel, this is basically the political science panel. And the importance of bringing political science into this discussion cannot be understated. As David Wessel alluded this morning in his comments in his plenary, the challenges and the opportunities facing America in 2050 are not just individual or an aggregation of individual interests. Neither are they merely market-driven. Rules and institutions affect our individual and collective choices and life chances, even in the freest of markets. Moreover, we would do well to consider the relationship between individuals and the state as we ponder the momentous societal changes happening right before our eyes right now. So if there's a theme across the papers that are represented on this plenary, I would suggest that it is the theme of path dependency, that structural and policy changes made in one era reverberate to the next era and beyond. We are witnessing this today and experiencing this in the Democratic presidential debates about the Electoral College. So just think about it. Decisions that were made in 1787 are affecting political outcomes today and actually constraining possibilities for reform 230 years after those decisions were made. So today's panel actually outlines the array of political and policy options facing our country. So Sarah Bryner, along with her co-author Grace Haley, look at the structural factors that affect campaign finance and equality, particularly along race and gender lines. This has implications for who gets elected, and in particular where they get elected and the types of communities that they represent. Jennifer Sciubba examines immigration trends in light of existing patterns. And in her work, she is employing a process tracing method to suggest current observations and to help explain those, but also to outline potential policy outcomes given choices that we as a society have to make now. Finally, Daniel Stid looks at Congress, an institution that is much maligned and honestly woefully dysfunctional. But as he argues, it doesn't have to be that way. If we make the right decision, he's going to outline potential paths that we could take that might actually help to reform the institution. So as we listen to these presentations today, let's consider what we know to work about our system, what needs tweaking or overhaul. And though we have a tendency, and I would argue a legitimate tendency, to be somewhat pessimistic about the future of our institutions, what I hope is that today's papers and our discussion today would actually point us in the direction of constructive critique and potential reconstruction, realignment, or recalibration. And so with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our first panelist, Dr. Sarah Bryner. She is a political scientist who earned her PhD from The Ohio State University. She currently serves as research director at the Center for Responsive Politics. So, Sarah.
Thank you, Andra. Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be here presenting the culmination of this work, and hopefully not the culmination, but a continuation of projects that we want to continue going forward. I am going to talk about two broad trends that we've seen over the last several decades, one of which we talked about significantly this morning, the demographic trends, and then what we anticipate happening to these going forward to 2050. These are, American elections are getting more expensive, and our country's population is getting more diverse. The 2018 federal elections were the most expensive midterms in history by a large margin. This trend may ebb and flow over time, and I expect it will based on political factors, but we believe that our political system and our legal system will continue to drive the total cost of election number, which was around $5.9 billion last cycle, ever skyward. Simultaneously, white Americans will be in the minority of the population sometime in the 2040s, as predicted by demographers. Danielle Lemmy, who who wrote another Peterson paper, points out that mixed-race individuals will make up 5% of the population by 2050. Diversity of this type, from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, mixing, coming together, runs against and counter to a Congress which right now is predominantly still white and male. So today I'm going to talk about the way that these two factors interact, and ultimately what the work of some of these conference papers suggests may happen to political representation in the United States. So I'm going to start with the money. You can see here that the total cost of a winning Senate campaign is the top line, has been creeping up with some ebbs and flows for the last, this continues back in time as well, but for the last 19 years. In 2018, the average winning Senate non-incumbent spent $24 million on his or her campaign, $3 million in the House. That's up significantly from prior cycles, and you can see the trend for all candidates in this table. And these figures don't include party spending, they don't include outside spending like super PACs and dark money organizations, which are increasingly a major part of the political spending pie. Upward trend. So no wonder the average member of Congress is still a millionaire, which is true. Even if you don't spend your own money to get elected, which few do, it doesn't hurt to have friends in high places. And I think, personally, more significant than the actual cost of running are the opportunity costs required to give up your job, find some way to pay for your children's child care. It's a significant endeavor to run for Congress, and one that not everyone can undertake. 2018 had some candidates who challenged this somewhat. Sciubba Gretchen Shirley, who ran unsuccessfully in New York, did get the FEC to allow her to pay for child care through campaign funds, and members of Congress are trying to solidify that going forward. And then famous examples like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became the youngest woman ever elected, running and championing her own working class background. These are changing the image somewhat of what it takes to run successfully for Congress, but I'll argue that neither of those candidates ultimately changed the game. Both of them raised a lot of money, and not unlike other House challengers. And ultimately, the better funded candidate wins their election the vast majority of the time. The diversity of this freshman class gives the impression that Congress changed from a white and male one to a more diverse one overnight, but it did not. Women ticked up from, Women ticked up from 19 to 24% of Congress, but that movement was entirely pushed by Democrats. In fact, representation by Republican women actually fell. There's only one Republican woman in the freshman class, Carol Miller from West Virginia. Even with this 5% increase, which is significant, calling 2018 the year of the woman, as some have, minimizes the decades of work to train and recruit women and candidates of color at the state and local level. So 2018 is really just a step on this path, and it's not a simple upward step. Improvements in diversity among Democrats only lead to uncomfortable discussions about the role of people of color and women in the Republican Party. There are 13 Republican women in the 116th House, the lowest number since the 103rd Congress in 1993. So these figures represent much lower totals than the diversity of the US population generally. This is yet another demographic change slide, so you've seen it all before. And they're represented far less in Congress. In my paper with Grace Haley, we examined how candidate race and gender can help or hinder a candidate's likelihood of receiving campaign funding, which is obviously an important factor in candidate electability. Candidate race can have a detrimental effect on candidate progress in several places. Among Democratic House challengers, where most people of color run, Democratic candidates are less diverse than the Democratic voters they represent. So you have a less diverse class of candidates than Democratic voters would suggest that you would. And this is more true in competitive races for a variety of reasons. Once candidates get to the general election, being a woman actually helps with fundraising. And there's some scholarly work on that. But being black hurts, only black. Among large donors, which make up the traditional sort of largest source of campaign funds, being a black woman in specific hurts. And you can see these figures on the bottom. So black women raising on average just under $400,000 compared to non-black, so everyone else, women raising $1.1 million on average. So it's pretty stark. Some of that is reflected in the fact that black women tend to run for different kinds of seats that are less competitive, but these, the statistical significance of these is still significant, even accounting for these competitiveness variables. So Congress, even with these diverse freshmen, does not represent the citizenry it represents or will represent in the future. At least it doesn't reflect it. Women, younger Americans, and people of color are all underrepresented. And to borrow words from my co-panelist, Daniel Stid, if the Congress of 2050 does not look considerably more like the America of that time than the Congress of 2018 does today, it will be hard to see the policy responsiveness or the legitimacy of the institution improving. Diversity should not just be isolated to one party, but so far we've only seen improvements on the left. I don't know why this is the case. I'm sure we can all speculate. Non-white Americans identify as Democrats generally, but women, and particularly white women, are more split. So why don't we have more white Republican women in the least? There's a bunch of questions about this. Republican women, scholarly literature shows, don't view gender as an important factor in their vote choice. And more importantly, women donors support Democratic women more than Democratic men, but this is not true for Republican candidates. Republican men actually get more money from Republican women than Republican women candidates do. So how do we change this, and why do we need to? So again, Danielle Lemmy's work on multiracial legislators suggests that people with multiple identity characteristics are able to cross formal and informal racial boundaries, bringing policy interests of one group into discussion with the other. This kind of cross-pollination, mostly discussed by Lemmy in the context of multiracial people, speaks to the general notion that people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds bring with them different life experiences and policy expertise. So how do we reach this more diverse Congress, which may be more reflective of the current and changing population? I'm not a policy scholar, but I have some ideas, as we all do. First, I think the Republican Party needs to shore up the number of groups like Emily's List on the left. Emily's List, if you're not familiar, is a political action committee devoted to electing pro-choice Democratic women. And they're very effective at getting money into primary challengers. There's no equivalent on the right. Elise Stefanik, a young Republican congresswoman from New York, has created one this cycle with precisely that goal, to elect more Republican women, and we'll see how that fares. Similarly, groups like Higher Heights, an organization devoted to training and electing black women candidates, can help candidates overcome money barriers by networking them with donors and PACs and other candidates. But these groups have had historically much stronger relationships with Democratic candidates and networks. So these candidate-specific methods may change representation at the margins, which is kind of what we've seen over time. But one of the biggest learnings from my paper with Grace is that white candidates are more likely to run in contested districts. Some of that's geographical, not all of it. The kind of districts that help flip a seat, held from one held by a white male congressperson to one held by a candidate of color. 88% of black women candidates ran in safe seats last cycle, compared to 60% of white women. So representation by different groups of people may live and die by the kind of seats these candidates seek. And to increase diversity, we need to encourage competitive seats and provide the candidates running in them with the monetary and networking support that they need to succeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So our next presentation is going to come from Dr. Jennifer Sciubba. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Maryland, College Park, and she is the Stanley J. Buckman Professor of International Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis.
Thank you so much. So what I want to do today is talk about politics, of course. And when demographers talk about population change, they'll say the three foundations of population change are fertility, mortality, and migration, and call out migration as the hardest one to predict. So the question that I started with was whether past would be precedent going forward to 2050. And it's been very interesting today to listen to the various plenary sessions and panels and get these projections that the immigration statistics for the US will be X, Y, and Z. If so-and-so continues, this is what America will look like. And I have a dual identity because I'm a political demographer, political scientist who uses demographics. So whenever I am among political scientists and they're talking about political changes, I'll say, yeah, but what about the demographics? That'll change things. So today, as I listen to a lot of demographers, I'll say, yeah, but what about the politics? And that's really what this is saying here. So the question that I started with, in particular, was thinking about whether or not immigration from Asia will necessarily increase, because proportional to their population in the world, immigrants from India and China to the US are actually underrepresented in the US. And then whether or not immigration from Mexico will continue, as Marta Tienda and others mentioned, of course, we've seen a flattening of migration. So how are these patterns likely to play out in the future? And so the three countries that I really focused on were India, Mexico, and China as the three largest senders to the United States. And what I'm arguing is that we have to actually look at the policies as the real gatekeepers for US immigration. In some ways, it sounds like the most obvious thing that you could possibly say. But when you go into the migration literature and all the theories about migration, some of them are very structural drivers of migration. So the global economic structure, the idea of push and pull, and that driving the shape of migration. And then some of the theories are very micro level, agent-based, so thinking about people's choices of whether or not to migrate. And there are some in the middle, but I don't think any of them give nearly enough emphasis on policies themselves as the bottom line factor that determines migration. So that's what I'm going to say. And in particular, looking at institutions in two ways. One is the policy itself that regulates flow. So think about it as actual policy choices. And the other is as the rules of the game. And I didn't have an opportunity to do this as much in the paper because I had focused on the first of these. But institutions are the rules that filter what the population prefers into policy outcomes. So as we will hear on the remainder of our panel, and as we've heard a few times today, things like the Electoral College, partisanship among counties, all of those things matter for how America's changing demographics actually ends up changing policy. So the bottom line is, our projections for immigration can't be made in a vacuum, that we have to think about the policy. And in particular, where are the choices? So what kinds of policy choices are on the menu for policymakers to consider going out to 2050, and how will those actually drive Indian, Chinese, and Mexican migration to the US? So to do this, I did some historical looks at migration, but I thought that for today I would focus on the four scenarios that I created. Supply-driven, demand-driven, ideologically driven, and externally driven. Those four scenarios are minus policy. So these are the kind of scenarios that we see floated around, maybe not given these labels, but floated around the media, floated around a lot of policy circles for, as we think about migration in the future, what's it going to look like? And my aim was to put myself in the mindset of each of those scenarios out to 2050, and then think about the menu of policy choices that could change that. So I'll show you what that looks like. One is supply-driven. So between now and 2050, you can imagine, India, Mexico, and China see tremendous domestic changes. Of course they will in the next 30 years. Workforces have already peaked in China, and median ages rise to 37 for India, 41 for Mexico, and 48 for China. So those populations are aging. We might surmise that China remains a country of net immigration, partly because of sheer numbers, but that their universities do grow in prestige and are able to retain some domestic students to study there. We might also, with the supply-driven scenario, consider that migration from the south of the United States starts to dry up even more, that those flows continue, but never to be repeated at the high levels that we have seen to date. Political stability is more likely as the populations age in Central America. We know this from the political science literature. NAFTA 2.0, if similar to NAFTA 1.0, might raise wages in Mexico, but at the same time displace a lot of small-scale farmers, creating some pressures to immigrate, so that net count might be more like 0. And then as Africa's population doubles, the standard of living, though, is likely to go up some in some places. The poorest will not move because they usually don't. But those whose standards of living are increasing in countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Kenya are likely to immigrate. So that's political vacuum there in some ways. So what are the decision points? One that's floated a lot in the US these days is talking about the degree to which foreign students should still be allowed to study in US universities at the same high numbers that they have been in the past. With a supply-driven scenario, we know that there are people who want to study, and that's a policy choice that can be made. Another policy choice is the diversity visa lottery. So if we take, for example, the question of whether or not immigration to the United States will be more diverse in the future, particularly from Africa, as a political scientist, I'm saying that will be a political choice, partly because of the path dependency. Those paths have to be carved to start that migration coming to the United States. It's not just something that'll happen because there's a greater supply abroad. And that's the point of this scenario. Just because there's supply doesn't mean that it actually ends up in the US. So the diversity visa lottery is one political choice that could be made to diversify the immigrant set to the US. Second is thinking about demand-driven scenario. We've heard a little bit about automation, displacing retail and assembly workers. And we also know that immigrants tend to fill our dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs, including jobs like elder care. So there will be demand for people to help take care of an aging US population. We also know that there'll be demand for STEM workers. So where are the policy choices here? One is H-1B visas. Particularly, as someone who lives in Memphis, let me point out the mid-sized cities in the US are the ones that really are hurting to attract STEM workers, because people have to want to move to those mid-sized cities. The talent has to go there. It's harder to have this homegrown talent. And so I know a lot of businesses where I live, we're home to FedEx, we're home to AutoZone, big corporations, are really hurting because of the restrictions on H-1B visas. We might also think about legalization pathways for people who are already here. And then a really tough one is, okay, so if there's a demand for dirty, dangerous, and demeaning jobs, will white Americans move to fill those jobs, or do you need immigrants? Well, part of the reason, and there's some research on this, is that many white Americans have thus far been unwilling to accept those jobs. Some of it might be a policy choice, such as wages, but some of it might be cultural value shift. So that's a question that I'm left with as to whether or not there's how much policy choice is on the menu in that particular situation. But I do think someone mentioned job training earlier. Perhaps a greater emphasis on job training would help to raise a profile of those jobs. The third scenario is ideologically driven. We know that younger generations in the United States are more diverse, and so between now and 2050, they become the primary political and economic actors in the US. But our institutions often favor rural, white-dominated political units. So it doesn't necessarily matter if the overall demographics of the United States become more diverse, and so what our elected representatives look like. It's the rules of the game. And so some of the things on the political menu these days are like birthright citizenship has come up. I think we can also talk about electoral college and districting as policy choices to see that the match between American demographics and elected representatives. And then the last one is externally driven. So thinking about what's happening outside. Will the other economies be more successful at attracting immigrants than the United States? Basically, to answer that, you'd have to repeat the whole study that I did, but from the perspective of Europe, for example, or China. And so will China begin to retain some of its homegrown talent and in fact even be a magnet for immigrants from Africa where they're developing a lot of economic relationships? Some of the decision points for this include family reunification policies in the United States, so the extent to which it's easy to bring your family to the US if you decide to migrate. Same thing having to do with permanent resident applications, but I will note that even though the waiting times are atrocious for some of our biggest senders to the United States, people are still coming. So when we think about this being on the political menu, it might perhaps be less urgent to deal with that politically than some of the other things on the menu. So in closing, I want to say that it was a very interesting opportunity for me to get to think creatively. Sometimes in political science, we don't have a chance to actually be creative. We're just following the rubric of what we're supposed to do. And so really wanted to thank the Peterson and Ford Foundations for the opportunity to consider how our current political rules of the game are likely to shape immigration flows in the US out to 2050. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Daniel Stid. He earned his PhD in government from Harvard University, and currently he serves as the director of the Madison Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. We're going to hear a lot about Madison in the next couple of minutes. So.
Thank you, Andra. And relative to my stellar colleagues on this panel, I'm more of a lapsed political scientist, but I'll have a go at this. I want to begin in following suit with Jennifer, just thanking Susan and colleagues at the Peterson Foundation for all the orchestration and support, and also John and colleagues at the Ford Foundation. It's been tremendously helpful and a real boon for us at the foundation, so thank you. The US 2050 project is focused on the interaction of profound demographic shifts and looming fiscal imbalances that we're going to need to reckon with over the next 30 years. Our ability to reckon with these changes effectively is going to hinge on how Congress functions in the future. And I'd like to take a few minutes to sketch out some scenarios for how Congress might work or not in 2050. And let me lay out two uncertainties that are going to provide the framework for these scenarios. The first uncertainty, reflected in the horizontal continuum on this matrix, is whether we will have more of a Madisonian or a Hamiltonian government. By a Madisonian government, I mean one in which Congress is a co-equal branch that checks, balances, and oversees the executive. In Madisonian government, Congress makes the policies that address the nation's big problems, hashing out settlements that embody compromises but that endure over time. By a Hamiltonian government, I mean one in which the presidency predominates via that office's prominence in the media and its institutional capacity to act quickly and decisively, making policy unilaterally in the executive branch without much fear of being checked or balanced by Congress. Now, beginning in the progressive era, there's been a secular trend towards a more Hamiltonian form of government in this country. That said, at key junctures, for example, after World War II, and then again after Vietnam and Watergate, Congress has reasserted itself and pulled our government back towards more of a Madisonian model. Our system is ripe for such a reset now. Whether it occurs or not remains to be seen. The second dimension of uncertainty, reflected on the vertical continuum, is whether our politics will be polarized or pluralized in 2050. In polarized politics, parties are big and inclusive, in pluralized politics, at the top, parties are big and inclusive tents, policy coalitions are fluid and vary across issues. Partisans might see their opponents as naive or wrong, but recognize the need to work with them pragmatically, taking half a loaf when they can and coming back for more later. In polarized politics, in contrast, the overriding goal is to defeat the other side in an apocalyptic struggle. Think the Flight 93 election article. Parties seek to excommunicate squishy moderates, and policy coalitions are tribal and fixed across issues. The other party is seen not as wrong, but as the enemy, as a threat to the republic. Thus, partisans must stay true to their principles, shun compromise, and win at all costs. Now, it certainly is the case that political elites and activists have become increasingly polarized over recent years. But most Americans are not as ideologically engaged and constrained in this way. It is also the case that periodically new leaders, policy challenges, and/or events combine to realign the issues and voting alignments underlying our politics. This, in fact, could be starting to occur now. Donald Trump's disruptive and disjunctive presidency may be hastening such a shift. But is it the last gasp of an old order or the invocation of a new one? We'll know by 2050. Let's now turn to look at the scenarios that emerge in this framework. And to be really clear, I'm not suggesting that these are the only possible scenarios, nor that the future will fit precisely into one of them. And I'm not assigning probabilities or predicting which one will win out. My crystal ball, I'll admit, remains kind of foggy, tending to my lap status. But rather, my goal is to stretch out a set of plausible futures that we could work to prepare for if we like it, or seek to avoid if we don't. Now, the first scenario is one we might call Muddling Through 2.0. It's characterized by pluralized politics and Madisonian government. A likely driver of this scenario would be the emergence of secure and stable majorities for one party in Congress, something that, as Francis Lee recently pointed out, has been the typical pattern for most of American history, and which tends to produce greater collaboration within the legislature. More secure majorities from one party would be able and inclined to take back the lawmaking power that Congress has ceded to the executive, especially in the post-9/11 era. But this is not simply a return to the textbook Congress of yore. Its members would need to fashion a new regular order fit for the information age, be more connected with and responsive to their constituents via technology and social media, and better reflect the gender, racial, ethnic, and generational makeup of the nation. To be sure, the policy settlements that a Muddling Through 2.0 Congress develops would still be messy and delayed and imperfect and maddening to policy wonks like you all and us, but it still would be probably the best we could hope for. And the one thing is, at least there will be policy settlements in this scenario, and there aren't going to be policy settlements in the other three. The second scenario is delegated democracy, and this is characterized by pluralized politics and Hamiltonian government. In this scenario, it will be increasingly difficult, given the demographic shifts, for candidates to win the presidency by appealing to a narrow and diminishing identity-defined base. The political cues voters get from aspiring leaders will thus tend to be pluralizing, not polarizing. In this scenario, Congress will continue delegating its powers to the executive. Calls for automating the raising of the debt ceiling, for example, or automatic CR provisions to avoid shutdowns of the sort we've heard recently would be examples of this approach. For their part, members of Congress in this scenario will be content to serve as constituents, serve their constituents as ombudsmen vis-a-vis the administrative state. Now, knowing I'm speaking to a room full of wonks, I can see some subtle grins out there. Many of you are thinking, this actually sounds pretty good. But the challenge is that it relies on technocracy and elites in the administrative state, not elected officials in Congress, to make policy. We thus could expect some real legitimacy problems, especially given the populist tendencies that have been set loose in recent years. This scenario also presumes that we will have experienced and competent leaders in the White House. I don't know about you, but recently I've had occasion to recall Madison's warning that enlightened statesmen won't always be at the helm. The third scenario, a perpetual hardball, is characterized by polarized politics and Madisonian government. In this scenario, the congressional parties proceed as they fight it out to blow up norms and institutions via tactics like court packing, the routinization of impeachment, granting statehood to places where they're dominant in their quest to win at all cost. I think in this scenario, electoral outcomes and the seeding of winners of congressional elections will become increasingly murky, contested, and overturned in a partisan civil war, one fueled by ever more outrageous, bifurcated and ambiguous media and social media. The fourth scenario, crossing the Rubicon, combines Hamiltonian government with polarized politics. In it, we would see policy mostly being made unilaterally via the president's extensive emergency powers, and national policies would thus be highly unstable across presidencies of different parties, assuming we still had transfers of power. A gridlocked and hyperpartisan Congress would essentially be irrelevant, a parliament of pundits, and to use Jonah Goldberg's apt phrase, and congressional activity would essentially be a media performance. There's a volatile quality to this fourth scenario. It could be hastened and or cemented in place by an exogenous shock of some sort, a pandemic, a catastrophic attack, rapid climate change, or a sustained economic crisis. Stepping back from these discrete scenarios, we might ask, what might we prefer for the future, and how could we work to head in that direction? I'd submit that insofar as we could preserve a Madisonian and pluralized balance in our government and politics, it would give us a better chance of tackling the policy challenges we surveyed earlier. How would we do it? When it comes to depolarizing our politics, some campaign and electoral reforms can help. For example, the way that money is flowing currently is really exacerbating polarization, and this is a problem ripe for reform, which is why we're pleased to support Sarah and her wonderful colleagues at the Center for Responsive Politics. Another reform that shows promise is ranked choice voting, which pushes candidates to appeal to voters beyond their base and engage in more positive campaigns. It also avoids the spoiler effect of third-party and fringe candidates. But reforms like these, if they can be enacted and have the effects that advocates promise, no small if, will be on their own somewhat at the margins. Ultimately, if we want to change our politics, we need to do so through politics. The coalition building strategies that leaders and parties pursue, the messages they offer to the public, and electoral outcomes that result, these will be what determines whether our politics become increasingly polarized or revert back to more of a pluralized model. Given the demographic shifts we've been discussing, there may actually be some tailwinds beyond the latter course. With respect to by the way, I should forward here, with respect to a Madison rebalancing, I think there's a window opening for that now. And I'll just kind of abbreviate my remarks here and we can take it up in the conversation. There's a select committee that the House has appointed, and I think you can expect some recommendations about bolstering the staffing and expertise of Congress so that it can carry out its role coming out of that. I think there really is a need to reclaim the powers that have been ceded to the presidency. But the point of reclaiming those powers would be for Congress to exercise them responsibly. I think there's more members that are thinking along these lines as individual members, but so the minds are willing, but collectively the flesh remains weak here. And I had a inspiring quote from James Madison at the end, but in the interest of time, I'll hold that off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. These are all really interesting papers, and I really appreciate the way that you actually interwove each other's arguments into your own presentation. We want this to be a conversation, not just between us, but with everyone else. So at this time, we're happy to take your questions. Just have two questions. First, please identify yourself and your organization. And then people have done a good job of this already, but it goes without saying, please make your question a question. Any takers? Yes.
Oh, hi, Gene Sterling. Daniel, I wonder if I might pose to you a more complicated matrix where you have instead of 4 cells, where you do another dimension, which is hard to show on a graph, but do 8. So when you divide it between sort of Madisonian government and Hamiltonian government, it's sort of whether the powers in the Congress and the executive. But I wonder if you might elaborate a bit on the division of powers. So I'll give you one example where I'm not sure how to use it in your framework. In tax policy, in 69 and 86, the first draft of major tax reform came out of the executive, which traditionally from probably the 50s to the early 80s, that's where you did the first draft of major policy design. Congress then was the decision maker. By the time you went to the recent tax bill, both the drafting took place in Congress among 535 members, as well as lobbyists who are drafting provisions and the decision-making. And I'm wondering if you might divide your power structure a little more between who's got the ability, if you want to call them elites, or at least experts, who have some idea of the policies and are asked to put up the options, versus who makes the decision as to what's going to be done.
So this question seems to be getting at not just divided government, but also what are the role of elites and experts?
Yeah. No, it's I would that's a good suggestion, Gene. I would take that as a friendly amendment. I think I'm more familiar with the tax reform in the 1980s, and I think that there was a, and to be clear here, I think in the Madisonian system, you really need a strong Congress and a strong president kind of working in tandem, and there certainly was kind of presidential and White House input on the tax law. I think there just were a lot of people in Congress, from Jack Kemp and Bill Bradley and Packwood and others, who are also grappling with the tax reform. So I think there was an ability of the institutions to work, in harness with some institutional tension, but each of them able to bring their institutional virtues to bear. And I think that's the thing we're trying to recreate. It may well be that it's more that model than the simplistic one I've suggested here, but that's a good point.
Somebody else?
Josh Gottbaum, Brookings. I'm curious, this gets to the question of political divisions and the role of immigration and the role of fear of immigrants. There appears to be an asymmetry in the responses of the two parties, at least recently. One is focusing on fear of immigrants, fear of the other, et cetera. That may or may not have been a continuation from its other white, non-white, not white divide. My question is, looking forward 20 or 30 years and noting that fear of immigrants has waxed and waned over time, do you expect to see a rebalancing between the parties' divisions on these issues?
I'm glad to say, I'm glad you asked that, because as I started really teaching about migration politics at Rhodes several years ago, I've always studied demographics, but really getting to the migration aspects of this and then moving into this paper, history is just repeating itself over and over again, as you note, with the fear peaking and then going back down. So the money, if you want a safe bet, is that absolutely it will level off some and then it will come back up. But from a political science perspective, the thing for us to watch for is that although we have this very polarized political system, attitudes towards immigration really don't fall neatly along the left-right divide. So there are significant forces on the left that are often anti-immigrant, including unions, and there are significant forces on the right that are often very pro-immigration, including businesses. And we even see that today with retailers associations having a lot of opinions quite different from Donald Trump on things like trade and immigration. So I think maybe the marker for us to look for is within each party, which sides of the debate, when do their voices arise? And so a lot of that will have to do with relative powers of workers and businesses, not just about identity politics.
So I'm just going to take chair's privilege and add one thing, in part because I'm a behavioralist.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about what this is going to look like in the long run, from a public opinion standpoint, we've been asking for about 30 years now how important racial identity is to racial minorities. We've now figured out that we need to ask this for whites. And the thing that's different is that we talk about the changes sort of, in demographics. We assume that the whites will be a numerical minority relative to all of the racial minority groups combined. There's still, one, the numerical plurality. Yeah. And then second, they also are probably still going to hold the preponderance of social, economic, and political power in this country. But what does that look like as we see population change? So this is one thing from a time series standpoint. We'll be able to tell whether or not that white identity variable, which new studies, including Ashley Jardina's, which just came out about 3.5 weeks ago, show that white identity is actually really relevant to predicting policy preferences and voting behavior. So I think now we'll have an opportunity to be able to trace that over time and to trace that with changes in demographics in the United States. I saw a question up front. Yes, Carl.
So I have one for Sarah and then Daniel. Sarah, you asked what was happening, why diversity only happened in the Democratic Party, particularly female diversity. And I wonder how much of that has been, district shifting. So it seems that Republicans have lost the suburban districts where Republican women used to win, and that's caused the number of Republican women to decline. And I don't know how much that would affect minorities. I mean, there weren't that many minorities to start with, but certainly with Asians and some Hispanics in Mexico, whether that's a factor. And then Daniel, it seems to me there's been a long campaign or a long quiet campaign by Mitch McConnell and some people to manage to outlaw the Hamiltonian state by creating a judiciary that essentially stripped the president of his powers. There's not a lot of talk about that, but it seems like they're close to being successful. I mean, they get another Supreme Court nominee and more federal nominees, that they'll be able to do that, and how that plays out in any of these scenarios.
So there are a number of questions here. So one is looking at candidate emergence and sort of shifts in partisanship of districts, particularly districts that might actually be more favorable to Republican women. And then to add to this in terms of population shifts, where are new immigrants going and how are they actually affecting the political landscape? And then finally, Daniel's model pretty much is looking at separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branch, but where does the judicial branch fall in?
So I'll start. I think that the 2018 major dip in the number of Republican women in the House is precisely related to the fact that a lot of those really swing suburban districts were taken by Democrats. And so that fed both the rise in Democratic women and the fall of Republican women. But looking back historically, the number of Republican women has never been on much of an upward trend. It's been pretty flat. So even though these kind of specific political time-based moments can have those sorts of effects, the overall trend has been the same. And so I think that we might see after the next census some maybe changes in the types of districts that candidates are running for. But I think what's more fundamental is just that the Republican Party, in my view, hasn't done much to attract women, and particularly right now. And I think that probably alienates people. They don't feel motivated to get to the polls. I have heard a lot of people who said that they went from voting for Republicans because they are pro-life to voting for Democrats, even though they're still pro-life because of the kind of Trump rhetoric around women. So I think that there's political variables, but overall, I think that the party needs to do more to try to actually draw in women as opposed to pushing them away. Yeah.
Is this a location of?
Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of trying to hide. So I might point to a recent session. Jason, are you here? Because Jason just gave us some data in one of the breakout sessions looking at how immigrants are, as we know, tend to settle in urban areas, and then whether or not that has a causal effect for actually driving white flight to the county level. But I do think that there is research done, but I cannot cite it right now, that talks about how the rules of the game in terms of electoral districting, as we know there's a good literature on this, determines the policy outcomes. And so I think we just have to overlay these two things. And I'm not really the one to do that.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
Daniel.
So on the point about the judiciary, I guess I think there's the ambition, and it plays well with fundraising about transforming the judiciary. I think the federal judiciary is pretty hard to transform. It can be done over time, and certainly if the president is president for 4 more years and Mitch McConnell was majority leader for that period, I think you would see a transformation. We'll wait and see if that happens. But I think also, I think generally, it's often the judiciary that's reining in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances. It's often the judiciary that's weighing in to rein in the presidency, and I wouldn't presume that's no longer going to be the case. I think we've seen that happen and then some. I think the broader issue, and I think generally in a divided society, this is more the role of the judiciary and the role of the presidency. In a divided society, when you're making landmark decisions in the courts, and in the White House, because Congress isn't in a position to hash stuff out, it just exacerbates the polarization, because half the people in the country are rallying to it and half the people see it as a, so I think that's more the dynamic. So it ties back a little bit to the underperforming of the branch that's really meant to make laws, and that's the thing that I think is most concerning.
Yeah. Over on this side, yes.
Hi, this is Cheyenne Polimaggio. I'm with New America. So this U.S. 2050 blue sky conversation and a lot of these, 3 scenarios, it seems that they make the assumption that our political institutions are going to stay the same, right? So Congress will still be largely dominated by 2 parties, but as we see with, the rising popularity of ranked choice voting and conversations around multi-member districts, we could see a shift in the number of parties that we have. So this is a question for everyone in the panel. So, if we're talking about lowering barriers to entry, people who are able to run for office and raise money, if we're talking about immigration policy, and if we're talking about, polarization in Congress, how would those maybe look different in 2050 if we're looking at changing political institutions, in particular, a higher number of parties?
It's a great question. What happens if we have a multi-party system as opposed to a 2-party system?
That's tricky. I'm not sure. I think that what needs to happen first to have a multi-party system is a different kind of voting. I think ranked choice voting, methods like that, are really one of the only ways that we can end up with a viable third party. And I think that literature on election systems bears that out. The kind of system that we have is just bakes in a 2-party system. So we'd need that first. And there have been states and localities that have started taking on new voting methods. And so there is potential that that could happen. As far as, as far as what happens if there is one, I think it's fun to speculate about, because I think it could go so many different ways. I think people 5 years ago would have talked about the Republican Party needing to have a reckoning between the social conservatives and the fiscal conservatives, and that may still be true. But I think that the Democratic Party actually has probably more uncomfortable tensions in it with, like you said, the union presence and sort of these ethnic tensions and racial tensions. They've become kind of an umbrella, a big tent party for sort of people that the Republican Party have alienated in some way. So I haven't thought about what the next Democratic Party would look like. I'm sort of curious what my co-panelists would say, but I'll just say voting systems needs to happen first.
Yeah. I published some work on this with regard to aging, looking at Japan and Germany and Italy many moons ago, and how their party systems actually made way, so I'm an institutionalist scholar, obviously, how their party systems set the stage for niche interests to get a foothold in politics. And so I think I would draw on that to say, how would there being more parties perhaps pluck from Democrats or pluck from Republicans, but allow those niche parties to be much more single issue. And so I think we could really look to some of the comparative literature on that. But then the next question that we would need to ask, because it's really not also just about the rules of the game, it is about preferences. And that's what I had argued in that other research as well, is if you looked at the public opinion data, did people necessarily divide themselves along only that single issue line to vote across the board from all the way from local to national elections? And the answer in those 3 cases was no, not at all. So I would assume something similar to happen in the U.S.
Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions, because I think they actually sort of, bear on this question. So you've talked about the idea of having multi-party systems, but think about, the relative stability of a multi-party presidential system in the context of, what we currently have. So whether or not, relatively speaking, that would be more or less stable potentially. And then also think about sort of a third potential option, that we still have a 2-party system, but that the parties that we know don't exist because, so it's basically like, the Whig Party goes away and it gets replaced by the Republican Party. So are we at a precipice where the Democratic and or Republican parties as we know it might not be the parties that exist in 2050?
Did you think that some of the generational research is the one to really look at for that latter question? I would think, looking at the preferences, and Pew's probably, I think I've seen some studies from Pew on this, that looking at the political preferences of the younger generations as opposed to the older generations and how that would affect it?
I mean, that possibly could be the case, but it could be that these cleavages that we see in both the Democratic and Republican camps could render them totally ineffective, and then that might create a third way sort of between fissures that might actually create a new type of partisan system that's based on a different set of issue bundles. Daniel.
Is a good question, just kind of building on this. I do think thinking creatively about electoral mechanisms that would allow for a fuller representation of the diversity in the electorate would be a good thing. I appreciate and we appreciate the work that New America does to lift up not only ranked choice voting, but multi-member districts, which might sound like a quirk, but 15% of our state legislators are elected from multi-member districts. Multi-member districts do a better job of securing descriptive representation for women and communities of color. And I think that would be a real pressure valve. And there is, we had multi-member districts in Congress up through the 60s. There's bills introduced to kind of make that possible. Again, that's the kind of marginal innovation that I think really could, make a positive difference.
No one wants to speculate on potential stability?
I just can't see, I'm trying to think of what would cause that major change to happen. And I don't see the major ideological questions of our time, sort of on abortion, gun rights, these hot button social issues, changing. And I think that so long as they continue to exist in the way that they exist, people are going to separate along them. And so I have a hard time imagining the point at which those issues turn into something else. And there could be a climate crisis or some sort of crisis that would make that happen, but I can't anticipate that right now.
So thank you for pushing me back to the question you posed. I think we have a problem with stability with a two-party system. And I think, just to pick, so it's not at all obvious to me that our institutions are going to continue to work like they do. And I think there's real scenarios now where you could just get into an unraveling of the institutional comedy that is kind of held together up until this point, but that's being eroded. And so I think even so maybe a multi-party system might lead to more instability, but I think it's also the case that especially in the Rubicon scenario, you can see how that could occur within a two-party system. So.
Other questions? I know there were a few hands. I can't see them right now. Yes.
Mike Murphy, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Thank you all for your presentations, really interesting. Question I was going to ask, I realize is a bigger topic that might require a whole panel, but it has to do with the role of technology. So I was curious, Daniel, when looking at your framework, it's suffice to say we're obviously in the middle of a debate about whether the role of technology in our democracy is how it's helping on the pluralized versus the polarized framework. I'm curious, because this would be open to all of you, how you're thinking about that in terms of scenarios for the future. Do you see opportunities, positive opportunities as opposed to threats for technology in addressing some challenges? Thank you.
So I'll take a run at it, but would welcome other points of view. So I think right now, and a huge chunk of the work that we've started to fund at the Hewlett Foundation has been focused on the problem of digital disinformation and how that brings out the worst in us. And I think the online platforms have economics that benefit when people stay on the site, and we know people stay on sites when they get riled up and angry, and so there's a microcosm there. But to your point, Mike, I think right now we're it's funny, there was this wave of where technology would save democracy, and now we're in this wave of technology is going to ruin democracy. And the truth's probably somewhere in between. And I think, and this is one of the underlying premises, if you were to read the paper in the Muddling Through 2.0 scenario, is that you can envision ways in which technology would allow for much richer connections between representatives and their constituents. Connections that used to be kind of fundamental that have been sundered really through the nationalization of our political life. And I think there's been some experimentation. Brad Fitch at the Congressional Management Foundation has worked with some people at Tufts and Harvard to really generate new ways of how members might interact with their constituents via technology that kind of work in a very depolarizing way. So I think that's a place where we're in the market for ideas and think there could be some potential that has yet to be exploited that might get us back to a more pragmatic stance on the connection between technology and the future of democracy.
More questions? Yes.
Question in the back here. One of the initial studies you did about campaign finance, 2 questions there. One, did you isolate on primaries, given that AOC did not raise much money compared to Joe Crowley, and then a lot of the funds came afterwards? Were you able to isolate that? And also, were you able to kind of look at some of the cases of maybe Lucy McBath, right? John Ossoff raised a ton of money, was not successful in Georgia 6. Lucy McBath did not get the same notoriety or same amount of money, but was ultimately successful. Can you factor those in, or is it kind of just this old nostalgia model? Well, also, Donald Trump didn't raise much money in the Republican primary or put in his own, but did a lot of digital ads. Digital ads versus TV advertising. Can you dissect that a little bit? Thanks.
Sure, yeah.
So yes, it's just methods questions about modeling.
So with campaign finance data, you actually can't pull out primary from general spending. It's all commingled. And so we use those final general election totals for this, only looking at general election candidates. And I think a really interesting study would be, I think actually a lot of the movement in candidate recruitment happens at the primary level, particularly in the Democratic Party. And so I think an interesting study would be to look at sort of primary totals, but to do that, it needs to be a study that's done kind of in real time, because you need to pull that number at precisely the moment that the candidate is running in their primary. So it's just a little methodologically complicated. You pulled out 3 very high-profile examples of candidates who got outspent by their opponents, and still won. But generally, sort of en masse, that's just not the case. So it's still true that even though AOC and Trump did win and spent less than their opponents, that just isn't normally how that happens. And then as far as digital ads and television, I think that actually speaks back to the technology question as well. I think that a movement towards digital advertising could theoretically drive the cost of elections downward, because that kind of spending can be more targeted, as we know, for better or worse, and it's significantly cheaper than buying a big media ad during the Super Bowl, or the kind of ways that candidates have traditionally had to meet up with their voters. So I do think that there's sort of a positive possibility there, but what we've seen recently is that rather than being used for sort of good, the technology has been used in ways that are probably not good for democracy. And as for how the money's spent, it's very hard to drill down into the way that the money's specifically spent by candidates because of the way that it's reported to the government. So.
And so we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Political fatigue. Yes.
So this is a question for everyone. How do you see trends in other countries affecting some of the U.S. development? So specifically, I know people who look at immigration from Mexico, they say one reason it's gone down is because Mexican fertility has declined so much. So a lot of the pressures have diminished in Mexico, and the U.S. is not as tempting a place as it once was. So what do you think of how trends in other countries will affect the U.S. by 2050?
So we have a great question here about sort of how international politics affects U.S. domestic policy. So Jennifer, we'll start with you.
Well, what I tried to get away from was just that kind of analysis, and to show that even though, because if we take the historical look, we see that it's the policies that have determined who comes in, not the underlying trends abroad. However, it is quite obvious that, and Pew has done a lot of this research as well, looking at why Mexicans who were in the U.S., immigrants to the U.S., many of them have returned back to Mexico. And so different from what I found with regard to China and India, overall economic and political climates do seem to matter for Mexican migration patterns to the United States. But still, there's some things on the menu if the United States wants to turn that valve rather open or closed. For example, we do know that in the last few decades, the more that the United States tries to crack down on illegal immigration at the border, it doesn't necessarily stop the flow so much as increase the illegality of that flow. And so we've seen a coupling of criminal cartels with immigrants, sometimes smuggling in immigrants on the off season for drugs. And so that's an unintended byproduct of cracking down at the border. And so that kind of legislation happens independent of the actual numbers about who might want to come to the United States anyway. So I think it would be a mistake for policymakers to just look at supply numbers without realizing the tremendous role that policy itself makes in determining who comes in.
So that looks like that will have to be our last question. I know Susan Tanaka has a couple of announcements to make.
I'll just do it from here. Thank you very much, panel. It was wonderful. My job today is, right this moment, is to tell you that we have a little bit of a break, and then we have 2 more concurrent breakout sessions across the hall in the same rooms that we used this morning. At the conclusion of those sessions, if you could make your way back in here, I know it says break on your schedule. What we're going to do is we're going to set up the break inside this room and then conduct a bit of a wrap-up session, and then we'll conclude for the day. Okay, so thanks very much. Thank you, panel.